The apartment was pitch black, the kind of thick pre-dawn silence that presses down on your chest like a weight. It was a little after 4:30 in the morning on December 4th, 1969, and 21-year-old Fred Hampton lay sleeping on a mattress in the back bedroom of a West Side Chicago apartment at 2337 West Monroe Street. His 8 months pregnant fiancée Akua Nijeri was curled beside him. Down the hall, other young Black Panther members, Mark Clark, Deborah Johnson, and a handful more were crashed out after a long night of planning community programs and strategy sessions. No one inside expected trouble. No one had time to react when the front door exploded inward. The first sounds were boots crashing through wood and glass. Then the deafening roar of automatic weapons. Bullets tore through walls, through doors, through bodies. Still half asleep, you could hear the sharp pop of handguns mixed with the heavy thunder of a Thompson submachine gun. Someone screamed. A woman's voice, high and terrified, cut through the chaos. Fred didn't even have time to sit up. A single bullet slammed into his shoulder while he was still unconscious from a sedative slipped into his drink. The night before by an FBI informant, then came the final shots. Point blank, deliberate into his head and chest as he lay there helpless. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Shell casings clattered across the floor like deadly rain. Mark Clark, posted as security near the front, managed to fire one shot from his revolver before he was cut down in a hail of over 90 rounds total. When the shooting finally stopped, the apartment looked like a war zone. Fred Hampton was dead. Mark Clark was dead. 4 others were wounded and bleeding. And outside, in the freezing Chicago winter air, the police who had just carried out the raid were already calling it a shootout, with dangerous militants. But in those first horrifying seconds, as the survivors were dragged out in handcuffs and the bodies were left where they fell, one thing was already clear to anyone who had been paying attention. This wasn't a botched raid. This was an execution, and the American government had just eliminated one of the most dangerous threats it had ever faced. Not because Fred Hampton carried a gun, but because he carried ideas that could actually change everything. If the raw truth of what just happened to Fred Hampton hits you in the gut, if you feel that sick twist of anger, knowing a 21-year leader with a pregnant partner was gunned down in his own bed, while the country preached equality, then do something right now. Hit like on this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. These stories of hidden power and silenced voices get buried unless we actively keep them alive. Your support today means the next generation doesn't forget what real resistance looked like. It means we refuse to let history repeat itself in silence. Prove you care. Do it before the algorithm pushes this away. Welcome to the story most history books still try to soften or ignore. This is the reason the American government eliminated Fred Hampton. To understand why a young man from the suburbs of Chicago had to be taken out in a pre-dawn massacre, you have to step back into the America of the late 1960s. The country had just passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Leaders in Washington stood in front of cameras, talking about a new era of justice and unity. But for millions of black families living in northern cities like Chicago, those words rang hollow. Segregation had simply moved indoors. Neighborhoods on the west and south sides were overcrowded. Schools were crumbling, jobs were scarce, and police patrolled the streets like an occupying force. Poverty wasn't abstracted. Was rats in the walls, lead paint poisoning children, and entire blocks where hope had been replaced by survival. The promises of the civil rights movement had delivered legal victories, but the economic and social structures of white supremacy remained untouched. Factories were closing or moving. Banks redlined black neighborhoods. Politicians talked about law and order while ignoring the root causes of despair. Into this pressure cooker stepped a new generation that refused to wait for polite change. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense had begun in Oakland, California, in 1966. Founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, What started as armed patrols to monitor police brutality quickly grew into something far more revolutionary. A political organization that combined self-defense with survival programs, free breakfast for children, health clinics, political education classes, and demands for power over their own communities. By the time the Panthers reached Chicago, the tension in America was boiling over. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 had shattered any remaining illusions about nonviolence for many young activists. Riots had torn through cities. The Vietnam War was exposing the hypocrisy of a nation fighting abroad for freedoms it denied at home. And in Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley's machine ran the city with an iron fist, protecting the interests of the powerful while black and brown communities were left to fend for themselves. Police brutality was routine. Housing was substandard. Unemployment among young black men hovered near crisis levels. This was the world that made Fred Hampton not just possible, but inevitable. The Panthers didn't just protest, they organized. They fed kids when the government wouldn't. They taught history the schools refused to cover. They challenged the very idea that black people had to accept second-class citizenship, and that made them dangerous. Because when poor people start feeding each other, educating each other, and protecting each other, the system that depends on their division and desperation begins to crack. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had already launched a secret war called COINTELPRO counterintelligence program, designed to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize any black nationalist group it saw as a threat to internal security. Internal memos called the Panthers the greatest threat to the country. Hoover personally labeled them public enemy number one. What they feared most wasn't guns. It was unity. Fred Hampton entered this storm at just 19 years old. Born on August 30th, 1948, in Summertargo, Illinois, and raised in the nearby suburb of Maywood. He grew up in a working-class family that valued education and community. As a teenager, he was an honor student, a star athlete, and already showing the charisma that would define him. He joined the NAACP Youth Council and quickly turned it into a powerhouse, leading protests against discriminatory hiring and segregated schools. But Hampton soon realized that traditional civil rights organizations were too slow, too polite for the urgency he felt. In 1968, he helped found the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and became its chairman almost immediately. What set Hampton apart wasn't just his oratory, though. His speeches could hold crowds spellbound for hours. It was his vision. He understood that racism and capitalism were two sides of the same coin, keeping poor people fighting each other instead of the system. So he started building something the establishment had never seen before. He reached out to the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican street organization fighting for their community on the North Side. He connected with the Young Patriots, poor white Appalachian migrants who had their own struggles with police and poverty. Together, they formed the Rainbow Coalition, a multiracial alliance based on class solidarity, not skin color. They held joint rallies, shared resources, and stood together against common enemies. Hampton's message was simple and explosive. We're going to fight fire with fire, but the fire we're talking about is the fire of liberation. He negotiated peace treaties between rival black gangs, convincing them to turn their energy outward, toward the real problems. He expanded the free breakfast program until it fed thousands of children every morning. He opened people's medical clinics and political education classes that taught Marxism not as abstract theory, but as a tool for survival. To the people in the neighborhoods, he was a hero. To the government, he was becoming a messiah. Hoover had given explicit orders to prevent the rise of any black leader who could unify and electrify the masses. The public perception of Fred Hampton and the Panthers couldn't have been more different from the reality on the ground. Newspapers and television painted them as violent, gun-toting radicals bent on overthrowing the government. Photos of Panthers in black berets and leather jackets, holding rifles, were splashed across front pages, as proof of a coming race war. Law enforcement called them thugs and criminals. The FBI fed stories to friendly reporters claiming the Panthers were responsible for murders and bombings they had nothing to do with. COINTELPRO agents sent fake letters to incite fights between Panthers and other groups. They smeared leaders as informants or sexual predators. The goal was to make the public fear them, to isolate them, to justify whatever came next. But the reality was far more threatening to power than any cartoon image of armed militants. The Panthers in Chicago ran community programs that actually worked. Breakfast programs exposed the failure of the state to feed its own children. Medical clinics highlighted the lack of health care in poor neighborhoods. Political education classes taught people to question the system instead of accepting it. Hampton himself lived simply, often sleeping on the floor so others could have beds. He preached socialism, not as foreign ideology, but as practical survival. Power to the people meant control over their own food, housing, education, and safety. The Rainbow Coalition proved that poor black, brown, and white people could stand together against the real enemy, the economic and political structure that kept them divided and desperate. This was why Hampton had to be watched so closely. He wasn't just protesting inequality, he was building an alternative. And the more successful he became, the more the surveillance intensified. Wiretaps, infiltrators forged documents. Every tool in the COINTELPRO arsenal was turned against the Illinois chapter. Yet, Hampton kept rising. His speeches drew larger crowds. His alliances grew stronger. National Panther leadership began looking to Chicago as a model. At 21 years old, he was already being groomed for bigger things, and that terrified the people at the top. Do you ever wonder what would happen today if a young leader started uniting poor communities across racial lines the way Fred Hampton did? If someone began proving that the real divide isn't skin color, but class and power, would the system allow that voice to keep growing? Or would it find a way to silence it before the message spread too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you seen modern echoes of this kind of unity being attacked? Let's talk about it. As Hampton's influence expanded, the opposition didn't just watch. It tightened the noose. The FBI and Chicago police worked hand in glove. Informants were planted deep inside the organization. One of them, William O'Neill, rose to become head of security for the Illinois chapter. He had been recruited after a minor arrest and turned into a paid asset whose job was to gather intelligence and sow discord. The pressure was constant raids on Panther offices, arrests on trumped-up charges, media leaks designed to paint them as violent criminals. Yet, Hampton refused to back down. He kept organizing, kept speaking, kept building. The character of Fred Hampton himself is what made him so extraordinary. He was tall, with a voice that could shift from gentle persuasion to thunderous call to action in a single breath. People who knew him described a man who was equal parts strategist and preacher. He studied constantly, Marx, Lenin, Mao, but also local history and the daily struggles of the people around him. His leadership style wasn't about giving orders from above. It was about empowering everyone. He made former gang members feel like they had a place in the revolution. He made poor whites see that their poverty was connected to black poverty. He made Puerto Rican youth understand they shared the same fight. Hampton's ideology was rooted in revolutionary socialism. But it was never abstract. He talked about ending capitalism because he saw how it destroyed families and the projects. He talked about self-defense because he saw police killing unarmed black men with impunity. He talked about unity because he lived it every day. In private, he was warm, funny, and deeply committed to his pregnant partner. He loved music and basketball, and late-night conversations about the future. But publicly, he was fearless. He knew the risks. He had been threatened, followed, harassed. Yet he kept saying the same thing. You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. By late 1969, the tension had become unbearable. The FBI had identified Hampton as a potential messiah who could unify black nationalist groups nationwide. COINTELPRO memos specifically targeted efforts to build coalitions like the Rainbow Coalition. The Chicago police, under State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan, were eager to deliver results. A plan was set in motion. On the night of December 3rd, William O'Neill slipped a powerful sedative into Hampton's drink at a meeting. Hampton fell into a deep sleep. Hours later, 14 heavily armed officers, armed with a floor plan provided by the FBI, approached the apartment. The build-up felt inevitable to those paying attention. There had been smaller raids. There had been warnings from allies. Hampton himself had told crowds that the government would try to stop them. But no one could have predicted the scale of what was coming. The night before the raid, the Panthers had held a meeting to discuss expanding their breakfast program and strengthening ties with other groups. They went to bed, believing another day of organizing lay ahead. Instead, the state had decided the threat had to be eliminated permanently. In the freezing pre-dawn hours of December 4th, 1969, the police moved in. They had the apartment surrounded. They had the floor plan marking exactly where Fred Hampton slept. They kicked in the door and opened fire without warning. The barrage was merciless, over 90 shots in less than 10 minutes. Mark Clark was killed almost immediately as he tried to defend the front. Fred Hampton never woke up. He was shot first in the shoulder, then finished off with 2 bullets to the head at close range. While unconscious, officers reportedly stood over his body and said, "He's still alive. Finish him." The survivors were beaten, dragged outside, and arrested on attempted murder charges that were later dropped when the smoke cleared. The official story was already prepared, a gun battle initiated by the Panthers. But the evidence told a different story. Only 1 shot had been fired from inside the apartment, the single round from Mark Clark's revolver. All the other bullets came from police weapons. The apartment was left unsecured, allowing reporters and community members to see the bullet holes for themselves. Independent investigations later proved the raid was a planned assassination coordinated between local police and the FBI. In the aftermath, the lies began to unravel. Ballistics reports showed the overwhelming majority of gunfire came from law enforcement. The supposed shootout was exposed as a one-sided slaughter. The FBI's role slowly emerged through lawsuits and leaked documents. William O'Neill's betrayal became clear. The government had paid an informant to drug a sleeping man and then sent police to execute him. Civil rights leaders and the black community erupted in outrage. Protests filled the streets, yet no officers were ever criminally convicted. A civil suit, years later, resulted in a modest settlement, but the truth had been buried under official denials for decades. The murder of Fred Hampton didn't end the Black Panther Party, but it delivered a devastating blow. The Rainbow Coalition fractured under continued pressure. COINTELPRO continued its work of disruption until it was officially exposed in the 1970s. Yet the ideas Hampton planted refused to die. His call for multiracial unity against systemic oppression echoed through later movements from prison reform to Black Lives Matter. His emphasis on community survival programs inspired generations of activists to build mutual aid networks. Today, in an era of renewed racial tension and economic inequality, Fred Hampton's vision feels more relevant than ever. The government didn't just eliminate a man that night in Chicago. It tried to eliminate the possibility of real solidarity across racial lines. Fred Hampton's legacy is a warning and an inspiration. It proves that when power feels truly threatened by organized, principled resistance, it will use every tool, legal or illegal, to crush it. But it also proves that the spirit of that resistance can outlive any bullet. The reason the American government eliminated Fred Hampton was simple. He showed poor people of all colors that they could unite and demand more than the system was willing to give. He made the powerful afraid, and for that, they made sure he never saw his 22nd birthday. Thank you for staying with this entire story. It takes real commitment to sit through the uncomfortable truths about our past and what they mean for today. If Fred Hampton's life and death moved you, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told without censorship, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive. Your support keeps these voices alive. And if you want more, The next video dives into another hidden chapter of resistance that still echoes today. See you there.